Greetings, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I want to go ahead and get my absolutely lovely mug up here on the screen. Just kidding. I'm going to have a fun episode for you guys today. Going to try and not go too much longer than an hour, which means that we're going to have to split this into a little series, I guess, but you know, part 1, 2, 3, all that kind of stuff. The video we're reviewing is like an hour and 49 minutes long, but don't want to go too long on these videos because I want to make sure they're easily digestible. Nonetheless, I think we'll have a pretty good conversation for you guys today. Real briefly, before I get into anything else, I want to go ahead and get to channel housekeeping. So those of you who are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And please consider sharing this to the different social media platforms which you frequent, whether that be Gab, Twitter, Parler, Minds, MeWe, whatever it happens to be, Facebook, I don't care. Get it on there if you think that it's worth it. I'm on most of them, so you can tag me at the synagogue. Obviously don't have to, but regardless, appreciate you guys sharing this to everybody you think may benefit from it. I do see we have Radical Love, Redeemed Team, and Jerome M in the live chat currently. So shalom to you all, and thank you very much for being here. I appreciate some of you guys, like Radical Love. I appreciate all of you guys, but the reason I worded it that way is because I don't post as frequently as I used to, primarily because of my having switched jobs in February. Makes everything a lot more hectic in my life. And yet a lot of you guys are still consistently showing up. And I appreciate that because it's a little bit of like, I don't know, brand loyalty, I guess. The point is I can tell that I am appreciated by some of you guys, and I appreciate that appreciation. So anyways, do want to go ahead and let you guys know about some of the things we got coming up in the future. First things first, in 3 days? Yes, 3 days. We are going to be doing another episode of Housekeeping. That's May 26th, a Thursday, for those of you who are not sure what day this is today, or more than likely those of you who are, not watching this live. I say 3 days, 3 days from now, and it's the 29th, then obviously that might be a little confusing. So May 26th, 2022, we'll be doing another installment of my Housekeeping series. The holiday we'll be examining on that day will be Ascension. Ascension is the 40th day after Easter. That's going to be a very interesting one. It's another one like Epiphany, Candlemas, one that's fleeting my name, Pentecost. Pentecost is the other one, where it's a universal Christian feast, meaning of great antiquity. All the different denominations tend to celebrate it, but for whatever reason in the West, that has kind of died. And so I really like doing those ones, mainly because nobody has any idea what I'm talking about, right? And so it's, when we say what is Easter, it's like, okay, well, everybody knows what Easter is. You're just learning maybe some fun facts and some history and stuff like that. But when we go to one of these holidays like Ascension, what is Ascension? People genuinely tend not to know what Ascension is, right? Or Epiphany and so on. So those are actually my favorite episodes of Housekeeping to do. Nonetheless, if you guys are interested in that, that is 3 days from now. It's currently scheduled for like 5 p.m. I'm going to have to move that way up because I will unexpectedly have to be working that day. So it's probably going to be closer to about the same time we're doing this video, 12 p.m. Mountain Time. But nonetheless, that is coming up here very soon. Also, I do have a debate over on Standing for Truth on June the 2nd. That is a Thursday. I'm going to be debating, I believe his name is David Preston, if I am remembering correctly. And we're going to be debating on whether or not the Israelites were saved by a combination of faith and works in the Old Testament times. I take the position that they were not, that they were saved by faith alone, that has always been the only way anybody was saved. And the gentleman I'll be debating is going to take the position that that actually changed at the cross, and that we are saved by faith alone post-cross, but pre-cross, it was a combination of faith and work. So that's going to be a very interesting debate again. And that's June the 2nd of this year, 2022. And that's going to be over on Standing for Truth's channel, who you should absolutely be subscribed to if you're not. Great debates going on over there. And in fact, at this stage, I used to say quite boldly that the Gospel Truth was the best debate channel for theology and just religious matters in general. And that wasn't an insult on anybody, right? It was just, Standing is not only doing his own his debates, right? But he's also doing his own apologetics. So he takes some time off of doing debates to, do his own content. Likewise, modern day debate, it's not strictly religious debates. You'll have political debates, flat earth debates, stuff like that. And so I used to say, if the very best channel is for religious debates is the Gospel Truth. That's not really accurate anymore, to be honest with you. SFT has come like really, really far. And honestly, I don't think I could pick between TGT and SFT at this point. They're both, I think, excellent channels. Point is, you should be subscribed. And also, June the 2nd, I'll have a debate there. And that's actually all we have. That's actually all. Oh, my goodness. Hang on. Sorry about that. That's all we have as far as announcements are concerned. So let's go ahead and jump right into our prayer today, ladies and gents, and then we are going to get into the video. Again, I think this is going to be an excellent video, and definitely leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, anything like that in the live chat with the tag at the synagogue. I'll get to any questions at the end. And if you're watching this after the fact, meaning not live, then just place those in the comment section and I'll get to them as fast as I can. Anyways, let's get right into our prayer today. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to again study your word and your scriptures, Lord Jesus, and to try and come to a greater knowledge of you, Lord. I pray that you use this video for the glorification of your kingdom and your kingdom alone, Lord Jesus. And I pray that you use this as a way to illuminate to us, Lord Jesus, what it is that you mean to communicate, the history of your word and your people, Lord, and just any way to get greater relationship with you, Lord Jesus. All the head knowledge is fantastic, but of course, the greater goal here, Lord, is to have greater relationship with you, to have revelation of your will in our lives, Lord. And I pray that this video somehow illuminates that as well. May we all decrease, Lord Jesus, that you may increase, and may we all get a full anointing of the Holy Spirit today, that we may not only understand, Lord Jesus, but receive correction when it's needed and stand fast when we need to stand fast, Lord. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name, and we give you all the glory. Amen. All righty. So let's go ahead. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I'm going to get a little sip of this real quick. It's coffee too, which means it's hot, which means it'll do more to break down the stuff that's in my throat. I apologize for that. Hopefully this is not going to be an ongoing thing throughout this video, because that would be super annoying. But nonetheless, the video today is going to be a review, at least part one of a review of Inspiring Philosophy and Dr. David Falk's interview with each other on the Exodus. Now, for some context, for those of you who don't know, I do not like Dr. David Falk. I mean that in more ways than one. I mean it personally. I think he's very arrogant. He's very rude. Not just to somebody like me, because who cares about me, right? I'm just some punk kid on YouTube. But when it comes to people who are actually relevant in the field, Dr. Bryant Wood, Dr. Douglas Petrovic, Dr. Scott Stripling, David Roll, et cetera, he's just incredibly dismissive, incredibly arrogant, incredibly rude. I don't appreciate it, right? I also am not a very big fan of his work. The Egyptian context of the Ark of the Covenant was pretty good. Which he actually has a book on there that's almost exactly that title. But besides that, when it comes to him talking about theology, when it comes to him talking about the Exodus, when it comes to him talking about Moses, not only am I never impressed, but I find that he actively doesn't know what he's talking about, or intends to deceive us so that we don't know what he's talking about. I don't feel the same way about IP, Inspiring Philosophy. I disagree with basically everything Inspiring Philosophy says, with the exception of the holidays aren't pagan thing. In fact, that was actually quite, what would we say, foundational in my own coming to terms with the fact that the holidays are in fact not pagan. So I appreciate him for that. For the most part, we're on opposite ends of basically everything. I'm a young Earth creationist. He's an old Earth creationist. I'm early date Exodus. He's late date Exodus, so on and so forth. But at the bare minimum, I do at least have a good deal of respect for Inspiring Philosophy. But I just want to let you guys know that, because that context is important. If I am being biased at any point in time because of the fact that I'm not very fond of Dr. Falk, then call me out on it, right? Call me out on it. Say, hey, CJ, I understand you don't like this guy, but we need to be honest. We need to not be, biased in any sort of a way. And because of that, I just want to let you guys know that context, right? This is a video. So actually, some more context. When it comes to inspiring philosophy, he did a documentary, the Exodus Discovered or Rediscovered or something like that, where he was arguing for the late date or the early date, excuse me, of the Exodus. And he got, I guess, called out on it by Dr. Falk. They had a conversation in private, and eventually he changed his mind and came to the conclusion that the late date was true. And then this interview is sort of them reviewing different arguments against the late date and in favor of the early date. And so I want to review this video and demonstrate for you guys just how bad, if I can just be perfectly blunt with it, just how terrible the arguments that Dr. David Falk uses are. Not only are they not good, they're not even serious. Like, if I had to pick out all of the different speakers on the late date, right, and say, hey, these are some guys who I think are seriously interacting with the data, David Falk would not even make the long list. He wouldn't make the long list times 2. The only reason I'm responding to him today is because of the fact that he is incredibly popular for some reason. And everybody just eats up everything that he says. His, videos are exploding. His channel is exploding. He's the main reason behind inspiring philosophy, changing his mind. And so obviously you go after what's relevant, not necessarily what's irrelevant. Not a lot of people talking about Kenneth Kitchen these days. A lot of people are, on the flip side, talking about Dr. David Falk. But I hope to demonstrate in this video why we should not be taking Dr. David Falk seriously. This isn't the first time that I have been able to demonstrate what, at least to my satisfaction, is proof that he is not a serious interlocutor. When we were talking about Reformed theology in the Westminster Confession a couple months back, we had kind of the same thing going on with, the redefinition of words and stuff like that. And that's a conversation for another time. But the point being that this is a consistent problem I find with this particular individual. Very quickly, I do just want to address this point here. Any date is a good date. While I appreciate the sentiment, I do not believe that it is true. And that is actually going to be a very important kickoff to what we're talking about here today. If we are talking strictly about the historicity of the event known as the Exodus, in other words, did this happen? Did Moses exist? Was there a wandering, etc.? Then yes, any date is a good date. To give you kind of a illumination of this, or an example would be a better word to use. If we were trying to prove the Trojan War, right? Then discovering Troy, discovering a war that took place at any point in time, discovering Mycenaeans going to war against Trojans, reference to Agamemnon, all that kind of stuff, all that would suffice to prove the Trojan War happened and to prove some historicity behind the Iliad account, right? However, it would not suffice to prove all of the different supernatural claims in the Iliad, or that there was any sort of infallibility in the Iliad, or that the Iliad itself was a reliable historical document. And that is where I say we have to have a little bit of issue, respectfully, of course, because I know that, what Redeem Team is trying to say here is just simply, if it happened, then we have good reason to believe the Bible. Appreciate the sentiment again, right? But what we're trying to deduce here is not just, is the Bible accurately describing a point in history, but is it actually a reliable historical source for that point in history, right? Not just did Moses exist, but does the Bible actually tell us when Moses existed? Not just did the Exodus happen, but does the Bible accurately tell us when, how, why the Exodus happened, right? And because of those different things, I don't think actually any date is a good date. In fact, I would go as far as to argue the late date brings very serious questions as to whether or not the Torah itself is a reliable historical document. And like I said, I would use the Trojan War as an example of that. And that's actually, I think, a good segue into what we're going to talk about here, because the very first point that he's going to bring up, or that he's going to refute rather, is the early date interpretation of 1 Kings 6:1. And essentially what we're going to see here is just outright denial of the scriptures on the part of Dr. David Falk. Let's go ahead and get right into it, because I don't want to just keep babbling on. This is the video in question here. You can see, of course, IP and Dr. David Falk here. The Biblical Exodus, Answering Objections with Dr. David A. Falk. And again, this is going to be probably 3-4 parts. I plan on making none of these videos longer than an hour because I want them to be easily digestible. So let's get right into this. Hope you guys enjoy. Again, leave any questions, comments, criticisms, anything like that in the live chat. Tag me at the Synagogue. I'll try to answer all of them.
And why is that not a good way to date the time of the
a little bit farther back? My apologies.
I'm still working on the script. Hopefully I can get it to Dr. Falk in about a week or so. I've written up something on all the external evidence, and I just got to do the section on the internal evidence. So that's where we are on that. But today we're going to talk about a lot of the arguments that early day proponents use to try to push the Exodus further back. And so we're just going to dive right in. So as you know, a lot of people have already brought this up in the comments of Exodus Rediscovered, which was that, Dr. Falk, everyone will jump to 1 Kings, and they'll say, well, it says it was 480 years, the Exodus occurred 480 years before the Temple of Solomon was built. That dates to about 966, so they do the math and they get to 1446. How do you address that, and why is that not a good way to date the time of the Exodus?
Okay, before we get to his answer, I'd just like to point out a couple of things. Thing number one, that should be an argument ender, 1 Kings 6:1. For those of us who take the Bible seriously, the conversation is now officially over. Okay. Some might say, well, CJ, isn't it a little rude of you to imply that they're not taking the Bible seriously? Well, number one, I don't think that they really care. Number two, they are just as rude to all of us. You're going to see them accuse early daters of being dishonest, of manipulating the data, all this other kind of stuff. Dr. Falk is going to tell some outright lies. We're going to expose him for it. And I know they're lies because I know how educated he is. I've talked to him before. I know what he knows, right? At least some of it. But nonetheless, the third thing also is, unfortunately, this is just simply true. If you're taking the Bible seriously, the Bible says that this happened in the 480th year after the Exodus had occurred, and that should be an argument ender. You either take the book seriously or you do not take the book seriously. Later on, what we're going to see here is, even though we can fudge all the numbers in the Bible, apparently we can't do that with our secular chronologies, which means we apparently, if we're Dr. Falk and IP, are holding these secular chronologies that are very, very poorly understood by Dr. Falk's own admission. He has said before that he thinks that the evidence we have for Egyptian history is essentially like a skeleton without any meat or organs on it, right? In other words, we don't have a lot of the information. Meanwhile, with the Bible, of course, we have all of the information, 66 books of it, in fact, pretty thick. This should be an argument ender, right? You either take the Bible seriously or you don't take the Bible seriously. And if you do take the Bible seriously, it said what it said and it means what it means, okay? 480 years after. Now, we're going to obviously interact with Dr. Falk's response to this, but just the insinuation at all that taking the Bible for what it says is not a proper way to deduce the chronology here should be an immediate red flag to everybody. They should immediately start wondering to themselves, why is it that you think we can't trust the Bible? Why is it that you think we have to do, a doctorate level research studying ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and stela from, 1600 BC and etc., in order to understand what God plainly put down in his word? Why can't we just take 1 Kings 6:1 at its word, right? For me, at least, that is an immediate red flag. Not just a red flag. We're talking like bright scarlet neon colors, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people are going to be an awful lot like a bull and just run right, straight for it. But nonetheless, here we go.
Okay, it's not a good way to time the Exodus because it ignores the genre of 1 Kings 6:1.
Okay, so that's the first objection that we have here to taking 1 Kings 6:1 for what it says. Now, we're going to read 1 Kings 6:1 here in just a moment, but he says it ignores the genre of 1 Kings 6:1. Now, you can go pick up your book. In fact, I would recommend you do so because it's a good idea to refresh yourself on what the Bible has to say. Read 1 Kings, read 2 Kings, read 1 Kings 6. The genre is very obviously historical narrative, right? This isn't prophetic, like, for example, Isaiah and Hosea and etc., or even more revelatory like Daniel or Revelation. It's not poetry like the Psalms. In fact, it's not even myth. And by myth, I don't mean fictional, but Genesis, for example, is what we would describe as mythology, in the sense that it describes for us how basically how the world works and why the world works, right? So where do the different languages come from? Where do the different races come from? Where does humanity itself come from? And et cetera, right? By the way, it's important to note when we use that word myth, we actually misuse the word myth in the modern day. Myth does not mean fiction. Myth means a supernatural story that describes the origins of humans and human behavior, right? And in that sense, we do have, quote, myth in the book of Genesis. 1 Kings 6 is not that, right? It's not myth. It's not poetry. It's not prophecy. It's not revelatory vision. It is quite plainly, quite obviously, historical narrative. In fact, even if you go to some more secular, non-believing historians, like, for example, Israel Finkelstein, they will at least say that it's history-like, meaning that they believe that the book is trying to communicate history, but that it adds a lot of legendary or mythological elements to it. I obviously don't agree with that, but the point is just to say, even if you look at those who are completely against us, atheists who think the Bible is not true, they still would conclude that the genre of 1 Kings is very obviously historical, right? So when we say here, oh, well, we just need to understand the genre and then everything's going to be cleared and peachy, that's just simply not accurate. We do know the genre. The genre is the most straightforward kind of genre that exists, namely history. The other thing here, of course, is that this is, and I bring this up all the time when we talk about old Earth and stuff like that, this is a form of what I like to call mystification, right? See, you, simple Bible believer, you just simply don't understand the genre. You just simply don't understand the historical context. You just simply don't understand the way a Jew would have thought about this, and so on and so forth, right? But I, because I've done all this decades of research and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially in doing this research, I do know these things, says Dr. David Falk, right? And of course, not only is that just pure arrogance, but it's also a way to essentially push off any need to prove what you're actually saying, right? We saw this with the whole Yom thing with Smokey Saint a while back, right? When he was saying, well, if you look at the usages of the Hebrew word Yom, and then, of course, we look at the usages, and it happens to be the exact same 4 dictionary definitions of the word day. And we pointed that out because Yom means day. It's quite simple. You don't need all of this mystification. But when you do all the mystification, it kind of baffles people because people don't know Hebrew, because people don't study Egyptian hieroglyphs, because people don't know very much about the ancient Mideastern context. And so when somebody says, no, you just don't understand those things, I do, it puts them up in a position of authority while making you doubt your own understanding of what the text has to say. And so that's the 2 big problems I see just right out the gate here. We know what the genre is. It's historical narrative. That's number 1. Number 2, this is simply an attempt to mystify you and make you think, hey, you simpleton don't actually know what's going on, but I, big name scholar over here, the wondiferous ponytail that I am, sorry, I do. I get it, right? And it's pure nonsense, but let's continue forward so we can actually hear some of his arguments.
Now, when we look at any text in the Bible, the first thing we have to ask after we assess the grammar is, what is the genre of the text? And we know that the Bible is composed of many genres. There's narrative genres, there's poetry genres, there's apocalyptic genres. There is also a temple dedication inscription genre. And this is a genre that we find.
Okay. Now, I want you guys to keep something in mind here. He says that this is a temple dedication inscription genre, you know, giving it its own separate genre, which, by the way, would mean that 1 Kings 6:1 is a different genre, not only than the rest of 1 Kings, but than the rest of 1 Kings 6, which I find to be incredibly problematic. But disregarding that, we also have to look here into the fact that what he's about to use as evidence of the more symbolic nature of temple inscriptions actually is not evidence of the symbolic nature of temple inscriptions. In other words, he's going to give us some examples from other Mideastern temples, and he's going to say, see, what we see here is an example of people using idealized numbers, symbolic numbers, etc., because of the fact that they're dedicating temples. And when we actually look closer at those temples being dedicated, we're going to realize that's actually not the case. In fact, these dates are probably very likely accurate, or bare minimum, very near accurate. But let's continue.
throughout the ancient Near East. Okay? And when we look at this particular genre has certain attributes that we cannot ignore when we look at 1 Kings 6:1. Now, first thing is that, obviously, just by the name, it is a genre that refers to the dedication of a temple.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing, attribute about a temple dedication inscription is it ties it to an event of the distant past. The third thing about that particular genre is that there is a sort of a numerological denotation of time that is not precisely accurate. When we look at all the examples of temple dedication inscriptions across the ancient Near East, one of the most peculiar things we find about these is that none of them are accurate right down to the year.
Okay. That's just wrong. It's just false. It's just simply not true. Or at the bare minimum, it cannot be demonstrated to be true. He's going to give us two examples, one of the temple of Ishtar in Assyria and one of a temple of Seth in Egypt. And in neither one of the examples is it true. In both of the examples, we have rough dates. We don't know when exactly the things were established, but if we look at the rough dates, they happen to line up near perfectly with the numbers given in each of the respective inscriptions. So when he says boldly and definitively, none of them are accurate down to the year. Dr. Falk is aware of this, by the way. There's no way he could have as much education as he does and not be aware of this. That's just simply not true. It's false, which means he's lying to you, right? He didn't make a mistake here. He told a fib. Now, obviously, like I said, we're going to look at the different temples, or the different temples that he's talking about. Again, it's going to be the Temple of Ishtar and a Temple of Seth. But to get up here and say, with the authority that he apparently possesses, not a single one of them has ever been accurate down to the year, and then not have one single example of one that can be shown not to be accurate to the year. I mean, I don't know how else to describe that than dishonest, right? Than telling a fib, telling a lie. You stretched the truth, and then it ripped, and now there's no longer truth there. Obviously, like I said, I want him to actually get to the main point before we look at it, but here in just a moment, we're going to read 1 Kings 6. We're going to read a little bit about the Temple of Ishtar. We're going to read a little bit about the Temple of Seth, and you're just going to discover this is just simply not true. And Dr. Falk, again, knows that this is not true. He has to know that he's not true. Unless he just slept throughout all of his college classes, he knows for a fact that this is not true. IP, I don't know. IP seems to be just absolutely amazed at Dr. Falk and his splendid knowledge, right? I don't know why. In fact, I really wish that he would show the same level of respect to other PhDs in the field, like Petrovich, like Wood, like Stripling, right? But apparently they don't get the same kind of appreciation that Dr. David Falk does. Why? I don't know. Couldn't tell you. However, Dr. David Falk knows that what he's saying right now is a fib. And it's not even the first, second, or third fib that he's going to tell. Or, excuse me, not even the only, that's what I meant by that. When I said first, second, or third, that implies that there was some others that coming up. What I meant by that is there's going to be a second and a third down the road. Worded that terribly. My apologies. But anyways, continuing.
Not one of them, which is very strange.
Let's pull up an example here just so you can talk more about that. So,
Sure.
Oh, I accidentally got rid of you there. Let me pull you back in. Okay, so what is this here? We were talking about this yesterday.
This is the
Really briefly, I want to answer a question here from Radical Love. She asked, what has he to gain from his assertions? That is a very good question. I often wonder these sorts of things about what I would consider to be compromiser Christians. There are at least two things that I can say right off the top of my head. The first thing is that this makes Dr. Falk very popular. He is probably the most popular, at least amongst lay people, the most popular late-date proponent of the Exodus. Now, in the academic circles, that's not going to be the case, right? You have guys like Kenneth Kitchen who are considered like just absolute pillars of Egyptology and chronology in the Bible. I don't know if he's actually an Egyptologist, but at least chronology in the Bible and relating Egypt to Israeli history and stuff like that. But as far as lay people are concerned, I mean, most people don't even know who Kenneth Kitchen is. Just about everybody, at least in our circles, knows who Dr. David Falk is. And the explosion of his YouTube channel is, of course, evidence of that. So that's the first thing. It gets him a lot of popularity. The second thing is it allows him to play hero. Oh, you know, we don't really know when the Exodus happened, and now I, Dr. David Falk, am going to demonstrate the veracity of this book, right? And you can find this kind of thing all the time, especially amongst people who have unique opinions. That doesn't mean that unique opinions are always this way, by the way. In fact, I happen to have some, you know, unique opinions myself. But it is a very common thing, and it's something that each of us individually should be looking out for within ourselves if we do have unique opinions, right? If you have an opinion that's on the fringes, you should always be checking your own motivations to make sure you're not trying to play hero. And by the way, a third thing that we actually see from that we would be able to attribute to Dr. Falk here as far as motivations are, there is rather, a sort of bleeding with the secular historians. And this is something that you see a lot in old earth creationist circles. To them, what is being gained is respectability amongst the enemy, right? I don't mean to just paint everybody with a bright red brush by calling them enemies, but let's just be frank about this. There's a lot of people out there who think the Bible is wrong and who make a career out of trying to disprove it, right? And what having positions like late date of the Exodus and old earth and stuff like that allows you to do is kind of sort of sit in bed with them, but with one foot out the bed, right? You're in the house, but you're in a different section of the house. You see what I'm saying? I think that that's a very poor way to do this kind of research. I mean, obviously, these are the same kinds of people who think Moses wouldn't have worked any miracles at all, who think that Jesus couldn't have risen from the dead. A lot of them would think that a lot of the prophets didn't exist, period. Obviously, you know, a lot of them are going to say the Exodus never happened at all. But nonetheless, that is definitely what I think, at least, definitely a prime motivation for people when it comes to, you know, fabricating this information or, you know, even things that are a little bit less dishonest, but still equally wrong, like cognitive dissonance and stuff like that, right? That's obviously my interpretation of Dr. Falk's motives, but I happen to be pretty well convinced that I'm right. Does that mean I am? No, it just means that I think I am, right? But nonetheless, I just wanted to answer that question here real quick. Now, the other thing here, we have a little talk here. I think this is actually a freeze frame from the Exodus Rediscovered documentary of Inspiring Philosophy. And it's talking about the Temple of Ishtar, which was rededicated to Ishtar 720 years after it was built, at least according to a certain inscription that we have. Now, you can see here, Tukulti Ninurta, or I think it's Ninurta. Yeah, that is an R. Ninurta the first is the one who declares that the 720 years has passed. And what we're going to see from Dr. Falk is an argument that this is not an exact approximation of time. Now, when we actually look at the rule between this gentleman and I think the other guy is Elishama, if I remember correctly, we're going to discover that that is, in fact, not true, or at least that it can't be demonstrated to be true, right? So let's go ahead and let him finish the point, and then we'll look right into that.
Inscription of Tukulti Ninurta the First. Now, he declares that 720 years elapsed from the initial construction of the Temple of Ishtar by Elishama to his own construction. Now, what's interesting about this is that 720 years is a numerological approximation to the distant past. It takes two numbers, 12 multiplied by 60. Now, we hardly have to even explain the 12 because we find it all across the ancient Near East. You know, the 12 tribes of Israel, you know, 12 being sort of that number of perfection, the 12 disciples. But 60 is a little more obscure.
Very briefly, it's important to point out he just used two Israelite examples to try and prove the numerological significance of 12 in Assyria, which of course doesn't make any sense. I'm not even necessarily arguing at this point that 12 is not numerologically important to the Assyrians, but I just think it's almost as if you're saying, no, we know that croissants are a really popular meal in Italy because we see croissants being eaten in France. And of course, croissants is a French name. And it's like, okay, well, Your Honor, those aren't the same place. Again, not even necessarily saying he's wrong there. I just want to point out the irony of using two Israelite examples to try and demonstrate the significance of this number to Assyrians, who are a completely different culture, a couple 100 miles away. But at any rate, yeah, let's just go ahead and continue.
60 in Mesopotamia is sort of the magic number of their system of mathematics. They had a sexagesimal system of mathematics, so base 60. So for them, that was sort of the number that they used to say, let's say they wanted to express a indistinct long period of time. They would say 60 years. Now, in other parts of the ancient Near East, they would use 40 instead. Like, for example, in Moab, in Israel, they would use 40 instead of 60. But it's the same concept. Likewise, in another inscription that we find, which is the temple dedication inscription at the temple of Avaris, the temple of Seth, the so-called 400-year stela, we have a very, very interesting and actually more compelling example.
Oh, okay.
Because what we have there is Ramses I and Seti I basically saying that this is a temple being rededicated, based upon the reign of a king Nebti that was a Hyksos king. So the hieroglyphs tell us it's a Hyksos king that dates to 400 years, 4th month, 4th day.
Pretty, yeah.
All right, so let's examine this. First thing, obviously, Dr. Falk finds it incredibly humorous that it was the 400th day in the 4th month and the 4th day, or the 400th year, 4th month, 4th day, right? Because apparently that should tip us all off to the fact that this didn't actually happen the way it was described. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it ignores the fact that these kinds of things happen all the time, sometimes intentionally and sometimes by complete accident. I'll give an example of each. So for an accident, or for an intentional one, excuse me, we can see the end of World War I. World War I ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And that was entirely intentional on the part of the people who negotiated the end of this war, right? Now, a later Dr. Falk, 2,000 years from now, might look at that and say, oh, well, this is obviously some approximation of time. It's not meant to be very specific. Apparently 11 was an important number to these people. And then they can go and find all the different reasons why they think 11 is important to us, right? But the fact is that is actually when World War I ended, and it was done entirely by intention. Another example could be the moving of the embassy from the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which President Donald Trump specifically wanted to coincide with the 70th year anniversary of Israel's founding, Israel, the modern country, right? So it happened in May of 2018, 70 years after May of 1948, because 70 is an important number to the Israelite people, right? And so there you have an example of people using numbers like this in a way that is incredibly precise, right? And doing so intentionally, right? Doing so intentionally. Excuse me, I'll get another drink here. There are also examples, however, of this sort of thing happening unintentionally and without anybody actually trying to make it occur. For a really good and kind of fun example of this, have you guys ever seen the comparisons of the Kennedy assassination and presidency with the Lincoln assassination and presidency? Oh, they were both elected in 1960, or in a year that is a 60, excuse me, one of them being 1960, the other one being 1860. And, you know, they were Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater and Kennedy was shot in a Ford, and so on and so forth, right? And you have all these different comparisons that people, make between Kennedy and Lincoln, all of which are true, or at least most of which are true, right? But none of which was intentional, right? And that's because, of course, this sort of thing does. And I'll give you another example of that. Pope Francis became the Pope on February 13th of 2013. 2013. Again, completely unintentional, right? The fact of the matter is these kinds of things happen. Sometimes they happen by design. Sometimes they happen by coincidence. But they do still happen, and I just gave you 4 different examples of them happening. So for us to just look at, it says 400 year, 4th month, 4th day, and that should tip us all off, and we should all get a good chuckle. Well, no, actually, we shouldn't. That's very poor, what would you say that? The study of history. There should be a verb that actually, historicism or something like that. But the fact is, it's not good, right? We know that these kinds of things happen. And again, we know that they happen by design. We know that they happen by coincidence. But the fact of the matter is they happen. And again, we just went through 4 different examples of this actually occurring, right? Where you have weird numbers, 2/13/2013, 11/11/11, and so on and so forth, right? Now, the other really important thing here is, and let's go ahead and stop sharing here for just a moment so I can share something else. The other important thing here is just simply that Dr. Falk, in saying that these numbers are not exact, is making assumptions which he most certainly cannot back up. And by the way, he knows this. Again, it is not possible that somebody who is as educated as Dr. Falk, who's studying this stuff as frequently as Dr. Falk, is unaware of what I'm about to tell you. Okay? So let's go ahead and share a different element here. Let's see. First, we're going to look at the first temple he talked about. So Elishuma is the guy who originally built this temple to Ishtar. You can see here a dating of 1945 to 1906 BC for his reign. Now, you can also see here the little CA. That means circa. That means we don't really know exactly when he started reigning, but this is a pretty good guesstimation based on the evidence that we possess, 1945 to 1906, right? Now, wouldn't it just be the darndest thing if we had roughly 720 years passing between a point in this guy's reign and a point in the next guy's reign who is said to rededicate the temple? That would be incredibly interesting, wouldn't it? Well, let's go ahead and see if, in fact, that is the case. So now we go to share here at another point. And I got like 40 tabs up, so I apologize that it's taking me a minute. And this is the king who did the rededication to Kulti-Ninurta. And what do we see for his reign? Once again, circa, so we're not exactly sure. These are very good guesstimations based on the available evidence, right? 1243 to 1207. Well, ain't that super peculiar? It just so happens that if you take 1207 and you add 720 years, you get to 1927, which is smack dab in the middle of the previous King Elishuma's reign. In other words, there's just simply no reason for us to assume that this is incorrect, right? We don't have exact dates, but what we do know is that the amount of time separating each of these 2 kings is roughly the amount of time that we were told is separating these 2 temple dedications and construction, right? And we don't have any evidence to the contrary, which suggests that this was actually built at some point in time that's not exact. And by the way, I'd just like to point out at this point, even if it wasn't exact, let's just say, hypothetically, let's say the temple was rededicated in 1207 BC, and let's say that it was built originally at the very beginning of Elishuma's reign, 1946 BC, right? So that would be about 739 years. That's 19 years off. It's very, very, very close to the number that was actually given. It'd be kind of like saying, if I were to come up here and say, well, President Theodore Roosevelt was elected about 100 years ago. And am I being technically accurate? No, 100 years ago was 1922. He actually died in 1919. His presidency was from 1901 to 1909. But I am being very, I am not being, excuse me, in my not being technically precise, I am getting very close to the exact date. And if I were to say 200 years ago, you wouldn't say the same thing. 200 years ago is 1822. That's a whole 80 years before President Theodore Roosevelt actually was inaugurated. 79 to be precise. But if I said 100 years, even though I'm still off, I'm not off by very much. And everybody would take that as a pretty reasonable rounding of numbers, right? So we actually have two different problems here. The first problem being that there's actually about the amount of time stated between Elishuma and Tukulti Ninurta, right? Ninurta, excuse me. But on top of that, besides that, we also have the fact that even if this wasn't technically precise down to the year, which we can't demonstrate, we can demonstrate that it's definitely within the range, but we can't demonstrate that it's technically precise in the year because we don't have exact dates, right? We would still be having a margin of error of what, 10, maybe 20 years, potentially 20 years, like at an absolute maximum. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not disputable. At least it's not disputed. Let me rephrase that. It is disputable. It's not disputed between early date and late date proponents when Solomon reigned and therefore when the temple was built. It's roughly 966 BC, give or take about a decade, right? 480 years from that would be 1446 BC, give or take about a decade. The late, excuse me, sorry, I just got a text message. The late date proponents of the Exodus are saying that this Exodus took place over 200 years after 1446 BC, sometime in roughly 1225 BC. Sometimes you get 1250, sometimes you get 1225. Those are both circa numbers, so you don't really have to be married to either one of them. The point is, though, that is a 200-year discrepancy. If, and I don't think that there is one, but if there is a discrepancy with the Temple of Ishtar, it's at most 2 decades. It's comparable to me saying Theodore Roosevelt was the president 100 years ago. It is certainly not comparable to me saying Theodore Roosevelt was the president 300 years ago, which would be roughly what we're getting from Dr. David Falk at this point. Right? We're going to see this problem here again in the Temple of Seth. So let me go ahead and stop sharing here, and we'll go to the Temple of Seth. Let me see here. Got some new people in the live chat. Iron Matt, Bloodfire, thank you both for being here. Jamie Russell, thank you also for being here. And shalom to you all. Appreciate everybody who is here. Please remember to like and share, subscribe, all the good stuff. Let's go to the Temple of Seth, the one that was 400 year, 4th month, 4th day. Pull it up here. Like I said, I do apologize, but I have a ton of tabs up right now. So I just kind of have to dig through them every time that I'm sharing. All right. Year 400 Stella. By the way, you guys may notice that I have Wikipedia up here. If you ever have a problem with Wikipedia, very often Wikipedia will include resources for you. For example, right here, just go on this little number. There's actually a name for this number, but I'm retarded, so I don't know what it is. I probably shouldn't use words like that, but nonetheless, you can actually go to the links from which they get their information. Obviously, this is a more official source. This in particular is going to be from Oxford University Press. Got this Wallace Budge character, or E.A. Wallace Budge, excuse me. I'm not 100% sure who that is, which is, again, just because I'm not particularly great at this. But nonetheless, you know, if you do ever have a problem with Wikipedia, know that Wikipedia is very often sourced. You can check the sources. I would recommend that you do check the sources. That way you don't find yourself being deceived. In fact, that's really just a habit you should get into. Anytime you see somebody saying anything at all, check their sources, check their sources, you know, bring this all the way back down to where the evidence actually originates from, and then, you know, make your deductions there. Nonetheless, this is the 400-year stele. Now, he did say this was made during the reign of Ramses I. Here it does say Ramses II. I don't know if potentially he misspoke or perhaps this is just incorrect on the part of this Wikipedia article. But nonetheless, it's a small point, so we're just not going to go ahead and put too much into it. All right, going down to the interpretation portion. Since the discovery, it was obvious that the year 400 of Nubti was not a regnal year, but rather a sort of anniversary, which of course is precisely what he had said. Given the 400-year interval and the explicit references to the god Seth, Nubti was initially considered to be an otherwise unattested Hyksos ruler. Notice what it says here. Initially considered. And apparently Dr. Falk is unaware of this because he said that this dates back to an old Hyksos king. That is what people initially considered it, but that is not what people consider it today. In fact, it is widely believed that Nubti did not exist. Continue reading. Thus, it was suggested that the 400-year anniversary could refer to an important event such as the construction of the Temple of Seth, or more generally to the beginning of a new era. The discovery also fueled the now disproven hypothesis that Tanis had to be identified with the ancient Hyksos capital Avaris, which we have now found Avaris, so we know that's not true, and that the stela may have been a commemoration of the arrival of the Hyksos. In more modern times, however, scholars realize the official Seti is none other than Ramses' father, Seti I, in his early career, and that the earlier King Nubti was not a real king, but rather Seth himself provided with fictitious royal titles. Okay, I'm going to read that again. The earlier King Nubti was not a real king. Dr. Falk was just presenting this information as if he was, but rather Seth himself provided with fictitious royal titles. Nubti is Seth provided with fictitious royal titles. So that's one thing that's incredibly important to mention here. The other thing is the fact that this is not, in fact, a rough approximation of time, or at least we can't demonstrate that it's a rough approximation of time. Here we see, going 400 years back before the period suggested by the stela, most likely when Seti was an official under King Horemheb. Notice, most likely, meaning we don't know that. And initially, it is suggested that this was actually created during the time of Ramses II, which would put it sometime in the 1200s. There's a very long period of time because Ramses ruled like 66 years. So there's a very long period of time in the 1200s that could be, but nonetheless, suggested, most likely, etc., right? Gives a datation of the celebration, or the celebrated event, of around 730 to 720 BC. 730 to 720 BC. Now, why is that important? Well, we're going to hear Dr. David Falk here say in a moment that the Hyksos were not around in 720 to 730 BC, and that therefore this can't be an accurate approximation of time. He's going to say they were only around for about 350 years at the time that this was inscribed, and therefore we have to assume that this is some general approximation of time. Thing is, that's just outright not correct. Let's go ahead and share another screen here. And this is going to be specifically of the Hyksos. All right. So if you read a little bit further up here, it's going to try and talk about the origins. It speaks about the origins as described by Manetho, although Manetho we don't actually have first-hand sources of Manetho. We have Manetho via Josephus. So Josephus records what Manetho had said, and it talks about the invasion of the Hyksos and all of that kind of stuff, and that's some context for what we're talking about. Moving on to this point here, Manetho's invasion narrative is nowadays rejected by most scholars. It is likely that he was influenced by more recent foreign invasions of Egypt. Instead, it appears the establishment of Hyksos rule was mostly peaceful and did not involve an invasion of an entirely foreign population. Here's the kicker. Archaeology shows a continuous Asiatic presence at Avaris for over 150 years before the beginning of Hyksos rule, with gradual Canaanite settlements beginning there circa 1800 BC in the 12th dynasty. I'm going to say that again. Circa 1800 BC, that is 80 years before the 720 BC, which we had previously seen, right? Circa 1800 BC during the 12th dynasty. Meaning what? Meaning that the primary line of evidence that Dr. Falk is going to use to say this is an approximation of time is in fact not accurate, right? We know that they were there at least as early as the 12th dynasty BC. And by the way, we also know that there were Semitic rulers in Egypt before the Hyksos. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with David Rohl and his new chronology, you know that that is one of the main points he actually brings up. And whether or not you agree with his new chronology or not, that's entirely irrelevant. The point is, if you're familiar with that, you'd be familiar with the fact that there are, in fact, excuse me, Semitic rulers in the 13th dynasty, which is, of course, before the 15th dynasty that the Hyksos established. Again, why is this important? Because we're going to hear in just a couple minutes Dr. Falk make the argument that this is wrong. It's a rough approximation of time because the Hyksos weren't there yet, and that is simply not true. And again, Dr. Falk has to know this. Unless this dude was just stoned out of his gourd during his college days. He is absolutely aware of what I'm telling you. There's no way that a PhD Egyptologist who has spent decades in the field is missing things that can be found with a quick Wikipedia search. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. IP, I could buy it. IP, like me, is just some guy doing research on the internet and making videos. Dr. David Falk is a professional PhD Egyptologist with published works in the field. There is no way he does not know this information, but he's going to pretend like this information does not exist. And again, it's something that I find incredibly dishonest. 1800 BC. So does that give us the exact date of when this temple was built, or whatever this event being celebrated was when it actually occurred? No, it doesn't. But what it does is it eliminates the argument for this being a rough approximation of time. And notice that's now both examples. He gave two different examples to say, hey, we know. Remember, he said there's not a single instance where we have temple dedications being accurate to the year. He then gave two examples, and neither of those examples worked. 0 for 2. One more, and you'd have a strikeout, but unfortunately, he didn't give us a third example. Anyways, back to the point. Actually, there was something here I think I wanted to read. Let's see here. No, that's not it. I have a couple tabs up here, and I can't remember what exactly they're for, so I just want to read them here really quick. All right. Anyways. So I don't know why these tabs are actually up here. I'm going to just go ahead and get rid of them because they're just not actually relevant to what I'm talking about. But nonetheless, let's continue and watch our good friend Dr. Falk here. By the way, got a couple more people here. Keith Colvin has arrived, and Alec Cox has also arrived. So shalom to you both, and thank you for being here. Alec, I did address the Wikipedia is not accurate thing. You do have to, first off, if you're saying it leans very secular, that would actually mean it argues more in favor of their opinion and not our opinion. So it's actually good to use Wikipedia as a source in that sense, right? You're getting the secular understanding. And if the secular understanding is disproving the secular arguments, then that is more evidence for the biblical understanding. But the other thing, too, is Wikipedia does have its sources laid out, not always, but often. And so if you do actually if you have questions about what I'm saying, which is no problem, right? You should have questions. You can actually click on the little links that they have there and do the reading for yourself. I have, and they do actually have more firsthand sources for you. The way I often describe it, Wikipedia is very good for general information, and a lot of times it sources to more specific information. But like, for example, if I was writing an academic paper, I obviously would not be quoting Wikipedia, right? So just a brief response there. I don't know if you were here when I had brought that up originally. Anyways, back to the video here. We're almost out of our allotted time for today, but I'll go a little bit over an hour. That's fine.
Pretty detailed.
It's pretty detailed, but the thing about the Hyksos is that up to that point, they had only existed for 350 years prior.
Okay. So there you have it. Up to that point, they had only existed for 350 years prior. That's just simply not true. Okay, it's just simply not true. Even if the dating of this inscription to Seti's reign is accurate, it's still not true. Or not to Seti's reign, but to when Seti was a official, not actually, so before his reign, roughly 1320, 1310 BC. That's still not accurate. As said earlier, Asiatics, Canaanites, whatever you wish to call them, had been arriving since as early as potentially 1800 BC. Rulers in the 13th dynasty were, in fact, Canaanite. The Hyksos were not the first Canaanite rulers in the area, and they did not, at least by most modern understandings, come in a giant invasion, or at least not initially. I think there are a couple people who do believe that there was slow immigration followed by a big invasion. But nonetheless, this understanding that this is 350 years off, meaning that they didn't actually originally show up until sometime around 1670, it's just simply not true. That is when the dynasty is established, roughly. And again, rough estimation there because we don't have exact numbers. But to say that there were not rulers who were of Canaanite origin, which is what the Hyksos are, or that the Hyksos weren't actually here at the time, those are just simply not accurate things. Dr. Falk knows that those are not accurate things to say, and nonetheless, he continues on with them anyways. 2 examples, 2 falsehoods. Moving on.
So there's a discrepancy of 50 years there.
Right. So when I held to the early date,
yeah,
I was really annoyed when early date proponents would harper on about the 480 period.
Yeah.
Because I'd be like, this is I understood biblical numerology. I understood what they were doing with numbers, and I thought that was a bad argument. But one of the things that I did think was a little more convincing was,
now I do want to point out here, IP says, well, you know, I understood. First off, as if nobody else understands, right? And I don't know. I'm a little irritated with this. And it's all throughout the video. There is this sense of arrogance amongst the two, where they're just like, no, everybody else, doesn't matter if they're PhDs, doesn't matter if they're early reformers, doesn't matter if they're church fathers, doesn't matter if it's the Bible writers themselves, doesn't matter if they're sources that are very close to the writing, you know, ancient sources like Manetho Josephus. None of them understood. But IP and Dr. David Falk, they understand biblical numerology. And I just get frustrated with that. I have no time for that nonsense, okay? Frankly, if you're just going to dismiss everybody as dishonest or lacking understanding, then I don't see any reason why we should take you seriously. In fact, we should give you the same level of treatment that you give us, which is clearly you don't understand, dismiss, goodbye, right? Definitely not appreciative of that kind of mentality amongst the two, right? The other thing, though, here is they simply have not demonstrated that numerology is being used here. Oh, well, we know that 40 is divisible, or that 480 is divisible by 40 and 12, right? Times 40 times 12, or multiply 40 times 12, excuse me, and you get 480. Therefore, it must be symbolic numbers. No, sorry, that's just, simply not how anything works, right? When we get to 2054 AD, we'll be 1,000 years removed from the Great Schism. And because 1,000 happens to be 100 times 10, does not mean that we will not actually have been 1,000 years away from the Great Schism, because that's just simply not how numbers work, right? Also, you know, when IP says, well, you know, I understand the numerology, he's going to then reference things like, for example, Genesis 5, where, quite frankly, what he's saying is very much in dispute. There is very good evidence to believe that 969 years for Methuselah and 950 years for Noah, and etc., that all of these are actual, real dates, literal dates, not numerology, not symbolic, not the years of clans' reigns, like Dr. David Falk claims in this video, which is utterly hilarious, and I'll get to when he actually, you know, vocalizes that, but that'll probably be in part 2. But nonetheless, you know, this idea that, well, I understand. No, you have a theory, okay? Let's call things what they actually are. You believe that this is a use of numerology. You have a theory that suggests this is use of numerology. You don't understand better than everybody else what is actually going on here, okay? That's just simply you being arrogant. And I'm sorry, but that is exactly what it is, especially when all the different examples of numerological breakdown that they use don't actually work when plugged into all the different dates. For example, they have Enoch having a child at like 5.5 years old, right? Or the fact that some of the numbers are just outright not divisible by 6, like 777, or 6D. Or here's the best one: the fact that the Israelites did not use a sexagesimal decimal system or sexagesimal numbering system. They used a decimal numbering system, just like the Egyptians did. Decimal meaning divisible by 10. But all of that is obviously a conversation for another time. Continuing.
When you go to Judges and you go to the account of Jephthah, he says 300 years, that's how long Israel's been there. And I was like, okay, well, that seems more like a rough estimate. What's going on in that passage? Can we trust that date, though?
Well, that is really going to depend upon how you date Jephthah. Where's your anchor point? What's your point of synchronism? And synchronism is how you correlate this to absolute history. Okay? So, what's your anchor point here? Now, late daters typically date Jephthah to 1100 BC. And why is that? Well, we don't actually have any hard synchronisms that connect Jephthah to a specific point in time.
Now, to be fair, that's actually true. With all of the period of the Judges, we're kind of doing guesswork. We don't have like an exact date nor a synchronism for exactly when Gideon, for example, was fighting against the Midianites, right? We kind of have to put the pieces together and go from there, right? We do, bare minimum, with this Jephthah thing, have a rough approximation of time. And this is a rough approximation of time. He's not saying exactly 300 years have passed, but he's saying, hey, roughly 300 years have passed. And that one I'll actually read here more specifically so that we, so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on here. But the point I'm trying to make here is that even though we don't have an exact point in time that we can synchronize Jephthah to on the calendar, there are reasons people get to 1100 BC as far as saying Jephthah is there. One of them, which he's going to mention, is the fact that 300 years, according to Jephthah, separate him from the entering into the land of Canaan. And if we take the entering into the land of Canaan as being roughly 1406 BC, 300 years, that's roughly 1106 BC, right? So circa 1100. The other thing is just if you start looking at the chronology of the Judges, right? The Judges period, there's numerous different ways to understand the Judges period. We know this because Paul says there's 450 years in the Judges period, which means he's probably including not just the beginning of the book of Judges to the end of the book of Judges, but probably all the way down to Samuel's death, which is co-regent with, or coinciding, I should say, with Saul's reign as king, and probably all the way up to at least Joshua's military leadership, which would begin directly after the Exodus with the fight against the Amalekites, and potentially even before that with Moses. The reason for that is because a judge, or a shofet in Hebrew, is actually it's a kind of leader. And basically what this Judges period is a period of time when these sorts of charismatic tribal warlords would sometimes take over temporary rulership of all or some of the Israelite tribes, right? And if that's the way you define the period of the Judges, then obviously Joshua and even Moses are still considered judges, right? Because they are tribal chieftains, charismatic, meaning indwelt with the Spirit of God, who are leading a tribal confederation. In the case of Moses and Joshua, the whole confederation, and Samuel as well. And in the case of some of the others, like Gideon, parts of the confederation. Now, the period of the Judges, as far as the book of Judges, is a little bit less time than that. Roughly 1350 BC is when it would be starting, and roughly, give or take, 1050 BC is when it would be ending, making it about a 300-year period of time. How do we know that? Well, Joshua is believed to pass sometime around 1350, 1355, something like that. There's a long explanation as to how that is, but to make the long story short, it is believed that Joshua was roughly 20 years old when the Exodus occurred. The Bible says he passed away at the age of 110. Obviously, if 1446 is when the Exodus occurred, you just take your 90 years from there, and you get to roughly 1356 BC. And so that's why we typically date the period of the Judges to starting around that time. And, of course, ending right before the reign of Saul. That one's a little bit more obvious, right? Because we go immediately into the first book of Samuel and get the whole story from there. So, to recap, the first thing is Jephthah says 300 years separates him from the entering into the land of Canaan. So that is at least one synchronism, if you will. It's a self-synchronism, meaning it's on the same calendar, but nonetheless, it does give us a 300-year, roughly, period of time that elapses between Exodus and Jephthah. But then also, using the information we have in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Joshua and also in the book of Judges, you can stretch out this time and you get roughly 1100 BC for when Jephthah would rule, provided that you're starting at 1400 BC. Now, the interesting thing about this is for consistent late daters, which Dr. Falk is not, this still actually holds true. For example, if you go right now and look up Chabad.org, which is a Orthodox Jewish website, look up Jephthah and then look up the Exodus, you'll notice that they say the Exodus happened in about the year 2448 since the creation. And Jephthah's reign, I actually have the exact numbers up here, is said to be 2779 to 2785. Just do your simple math there. What do you realize? It's roughly 300 years of time, a little bit over. It's about 331 to be precise. But given the fact that there was a 40-year wandering period and then they entered into the land, that actually is only a 9-year discrepancy, 291 years separating Jephthah from the entering into the land, which of course is very close to 300. Now, the interesting thing about this is Chabad actually correlates these dates to the late date. And so they would put Jephthah's reign at being between 982 and 976 BC. Or his judgeship, I guess. I don't know if it's necessarily accurate to say his reign, although he was a kind of a tribal warlord, right? But I digress. And the reason they do that is because they're actually being consistent. Their 2448 is roughly 1313 BC. Obviously, neither me or Dr. Falk would agree with that exact date, but the point is they are then taking that date and doing a straightforward chronology of Judges, as well as taking Jephthah at his word. They come to Jephthah being around at about 982 BC. Not accurate, but the point is they're at least being consistent, and they're demonstrating that regardless of if you get to a late date or an early date, there is still, just chronologically speaking, if you take the book of Judges at face value, there is still roughly a 300-year period of time in between these two different events. Hope that I'm explaining this in a way that's making sense. Well, actually, I was about to preempt something, but let's not do that. Let's actually go ahead and let Dr. Falk continue. Do I still have my screen shared? I do. Awesome.
There's nothing there. That's hard evidence.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the late date, we sort of figure that the period of the Judges is 200 years. From basically 1200 to 1000 BC. So we compromise.
Okay, so that is just simply put horrible. And it makes mincemeat of what we are told by the scriptures, okay? Jephthah, so notice he said Jephthah is in the midpoint of the period of Judges, which would mean he's roughly 1 century separated from the entering into the land of Canaan, give or take. And he's apparently so historically inept that he multiplies that century by 3 times, making it 100 years longer than the entire period of Judges at all. So Dr. Falk is, and by the way, he's just going to admit this in a couple minutes, Dr. Falk is just taking Jephthah and throwing him away. It's worthless. We can't learn anything from it. Not only is he wrong in the sense that it hasn't been 300 years since they entered, it's only been 100 according to Dr. Falk, but he's wrong in the sense that the period of Judges total didn't even last 300 years, according to Dr. Falk. Now, not only does that fly in the face of what we have from Jephthah, who says 300 years have passed, it also flies in the face of what we get from Ezra in 1 Chronicles, who says that 19 generations passed between King David and King Solomon and the prophet Moses and the Exodus, right? 19 generations. A generation is roughly 25 years. You can do the math yourself. It puts you at roughly 1475 BC. And of course, 25 years being an approximation, we know that 1475 can be reduced pretty easily to 1446. So that's the first problem. Second problem, of course, it flies in the face of what Paul says in the book of Acts. He says that the period of Judges lasted 450 years. Now, again, he's not talking about the period of Judges, the book. He's talking about the period of Judges, the time in which Israel was ruled by Shophatim, which begins either with Moses or Joshua and would extend all the way into the death of Samuel, the very last of them, right? But regardless of the explanation of that, the point is, Dr. Falk has effectively said, you can't trust Jephthah, you can't trust Ezra in 1 Chronicles, and you can't trust Paul the Apostle either, or Luke for that matter, because Luke at no point in time decided that he was going to correct Paul the Apostle while writing the book of Acts. And by the way, that also means Samuel as well. If you believe, as I do, that the traditional authorship of the book of Judges, which would mean Samuel, then you must believe that Samuel also was wrong here because he felt no necessity to correct Jephthah at this point in time, which is an important thing, by the way, because these kinds of corrections and clarifications and stuff like that happen all the time in Scripture. Like, for example, you'll have a town. I can't remember I think it's Kirjath Arba, but nonetheless, Heshbon, as we call it in the modern day, right? And they'll use the old name, but then they'll clarify which today is known as Heshbon or Hebron or Bethlehem or whatever it happens to be, right? In other words, when there's an inaccuracy in the Bible, the writer actually clarifies, or excuse me, when there's an inaccuracy, let me rephrase that because there's not an inaccuracy in the Bible. When there's an inaccuracy on the part of a character in the Bible, meaning one of the people who's speaking here, the writer will almost always clarify, hey, this is why this is here. Just a great example of this, the birth of Samson. This is in the book of Judges. At the birth of Samson, when Samson's father doesn't know who the angel of the Lord actually is. It actually clarifies and says he asks these things because he did not know that he was an angel of the Lord, right? That's the same writer. These clarifications are all throughout the Bible, clarifying this is why this place is called this. This is why this person was wrong. This is why this person has a misunderstanding, so on and so forth. But here, Dr. Falk is saying the writer of Judges biffed, Jephthah biffed, the writer of Chronicles biffed, Paul biffed, the writer of Acts biffed. All of these guys are scriptural writers or speakers. They all biffed. But Dr. Falk apparently didn't. Dr. Falk, super wise and splendiferous man that he is, apparently has it all figured out. In fact, really, what we should be doing is writing a book of Dr. David Falk and following that. Because apparently, there's just no way in hell that we can actually trust anything that comes from the Bible historically. 200 years. Absolutely mind-numbing to think that this could even be remotely trustworthy. And by the way, it's also actually worse than that. He's wrong in saying it's roughly 200 years because, again, it's very firmly established when, at least between late daters and early daters, there are going to be some people who are going to disagree with this, but me and Dr. Falk, both of our camps, are both going to agree that it's pretty well established when the United Monarchy started. Roughly 970 BC is when Solomon would start his reign. 40 years back from that would mean roughly 1010 BC is when David would start his reign. Hey, by the way, David's not actually the first king. Saul is. And how long did Saul reign? We don't really know. Some people say 40 years. Some people say 20 years. Let's just call it 2 because that's the shortest that we've ever heard. That still puts us as 1012. And the period of the Judges is supposed to happen 40 years after the Exodus, which according to his reckoning happens around 1225. Okay, 1185 to 1012 is 173 years. It can get even worse than that if we go 40 years with Saul. That'd be 1050. 1185 to 1050 is 135 years. So he's scrunching all of this into a very small period of time and basically just saying, hey, all these biblical writers, these guys who were inspired by the Holy Spirit to write scripture, to preach scripture, to give prophecy, yeah, they're just trash. But what I know, Dr. David Falk, that's not trash. I assure you.
we put it smack dab in the middle. Okay, so, and that makes a lot of sense because given it's a relatively short period of time, we can approximate that.
Right.
Okay. It becomes a lot more sticky for an early dater because for them, the period of the judges is 400 years. How are they anchoring that? Well, how they are anchoring that is they are taking the date of the Exodus, basically subtracting 300 years to date Jephthah to 1100 BC. So their use of the dating here to try to say that this is proof for the early Exodus is really circular. Because if they had used the same methodology that, say, the late daters had done, they would be placing Jephthah at say, midway in that span.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so that's not accurate. Again, it's not entirely accurate. Let me make sure I'm being honest here. It is true to say that you can take, a lot of people will take the date of the Exodus, right, whatever they believe it is. Again, you can go to Chabad.org and see this from a late dater, but they'll take the date of the Exodus, move it about 300 years forward, excuse me, and then that would give you the date of Jephthah. Again, both the late and early daters will do that, and again, you can go to Chabad.org to see an example of this from a late dater. The Jewish calendar it's not the same date that they would use, but it is a much later date than we would use, right? Now, Redeem Team says we're going to get corn bombed. I don't know if that's a reference to the popcorn thing that Dr. Falk does, but yeah, well, if he does, he does. If he doesn't, he doesn't. Who cares, right? So let's go ahead and pull up a chronology here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for you guys. Microsoft Edge tab. There we are. All right. Here's a chronology of Judges' timeline. Okay. Now, is this timeline accurate? Isn't it accurate? Obviously, that's a conversation for another time. I obviously believe that it is at least very near accurate, right? But, the point there is just to say we could do a whole episode on the Judges' chronology itself. All right. Here we can see a layout of the dates which are given, or of the years rather, which are given specifically in the book of Judges. Why are we starting in 1350? Because like I said previously, that is roughly around when Joshua is said to have passed. All right. Othniel, 8 years of oppression, followed by 40 years of peace. That would be 48 years total. All right. So that's where we got our first 48 years. Okay. Then we have Naomi, Moab, and all that kind of stuff happening from the book of Ruth here. That's obviously in the period of the Judges, but it is not the book of Judges, right? We have Eglon killed in Judges 3, also Naomi's 2 sons. Ehud and his oppression, 18 years of oppression, 80 years of peace, 98 years total. So notice 48, 98. What does that get you to? About 146 years. Now we have here Shamgar and Deborah, which is a total of 60 years. It is believed that Gideon is overlapping with this, which is 48 years, but you have 40 years of peace after Deborah and Gideon. All right, so we had our previous 146, get the 60 here. That'll put us at about 206 years roughly. Obviously, you can see up here it has 95 years given in total. And that's because you also have things here from Eli, Samson, Jephthah, all that other kind of stuff. There's another date here I wanted to get to really quickly. Let's see. There's the 40 years of Eli here. So 40 years attitude, you can see it's connecting right here, right? So this is the end of that 60-year period. This is the beginning of that 40-year period. So 40 or 48, excuse me. Then 80, that'll get you at 138. Then 60, that'll get you at 198. I think I said 206 earlier, but that's not accurate. 40 and 80 is obviously, and actually I just said 138 too. I'm doing my math terribly. It's 128. So this would be 188, excuse me. 40 here would be 228. And then you have obviously Jephthah right here in roughly the middle point of that, which is 228 years. Okay, that's 228 years, though, from 1350. Of course, 50 years previous to that would be the entering into the land of Canaan. That would get you to about 278 years. Or, excuse me, if you do it exactly, it'd be 1406. It'd be 56, it'd be about 284 years. 284 years happens to be 16 years off of 300. So, is it true that we are simply taking the year of the Exodus and then subtracting 300 and getting ourselves to Jephthah? No, it is not. If you actually take straightforward interpretation of Judges chronology, as is done here, it's not exactly 300 years, but Jephthah didn't claim it was exactly 300 years. It is very near 300 years, like 284. And again, that would be roughly analogous to me saying Theodore Roosevelt was president 100 years ago. Am I being technically precise? No. But am I being accurate? Of course. Nobody would look at that statement and say I was being inaccurate. Now, if I said he ruled or was president 200 years ago, everybody would look at that statement and say, no, yeah, actually, that is pretty well inaccurate. Because at that point, my rough guesstimation is getting way off, like over a century off, right? So is it true to say that we are just simply dating this by taking the 300 and subtracting that from the Exodus date? No. We're also counting straightforward from the time that it is believed this started, putting the years together, and what do you get? Jephthah being around the year 1100. In fact, a little bit before, if you want to get technically precise, as you can see here, 1118 BC. So, not accurate. Again, Dr. David Falk knows that. Dr. David Falk simply does not care. The other thing here, he's about to say in a moment that basically Jephthah is just wrong. The Jephthah cannot be trusted, that all the details that Jephthah actually has here are incorrect. And that is also something we're going to be able to demonstrate quite easily is not true. By the way, if I have poorly explained something or misarticulated something, or you have questions about something, anything like that, please feel free to ask. Tag me at the synagogue. I'll try and answer. Even if you think it's just like I'm way off, like, hey, CJ, I think you're like being kind of ridiculous here. Go ahead, right? All of the questions, comments, criticisms, all that kind of stuff are welcome. But nonetheless, let's just go ahead and by the way, when we finish here with Jephthah, we're going to end this and we'll move on to part 2. Probably, I don't know, Wednesday? I want to do an open room tomorrow, so we'll go with Wednesday. All right.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Not 1100.
Mm-hmm.
They're following the same methodology. But they're not following the same methodology. They're actually using the Exodus date to date Jephthah. And then using
not
accurate to date the Exodus.
But
yeah,
you know.
But he does say
who cares about accuracy
years,
on
so doesn't that mean they've been there for more than 200 though?
Well, maybe, but so you look at that entire passage and you start getting some.
Real quickly, I do see one question here. Radical Love asked, does the majority date the chronology the same as this chart? Sort of. What I mean by that is because it's very difficult to date Judges precisely, and so you can find a lot of different interpretations of when exactly all the different events in the period of Judges are taking place. Now, if what you mean by that is do the majority of early date proponents date similarly to this chart, then the answer would be yes. But just straightforward majority Probably not, because there's going to be early date proponents who date this in a different way. There's also going to be all the late date proponents who date this in a completely different way. And of course, you're going to have, even besides that, people who don't think the Judges period happened at all, and that this is all basically just a bunch of symbolism and myth. So in a sense, yes, the majority of your early daters are going to take that chart with perhaps a few nicks and tweaks here, but for the most part, as straightforward as we had seen. Not always. A really good look into this, if you're interested in the early date position, is Dr. Bryant Wood's Judges Forgotten History. It's, I believe, here on YouTube, actually. Not 100% sure, to be honest with you, but I do think it is here on YouTube. It's definitely on their Associates for Biblical Research website, which is BibleArchaeology.org. But nonetheless, definitely an excellent question, though, because the period of the Judges, out of all of the periods in Bible history, it's right up there with the era of the patriarchs for, the era that has the most questions surrounding it. But as far as those of us who take an early date, the chart I just gave is going to be accepted by the majority. And again, an in-depth look into that can be found by Dr. Bryant Wood.
Wow. How would I say this?
Inaccuracies.
Yeah, inaccuracies. It's really one of the things we have to understand about the whole Judges 11 narrative is that it's Jephthah's botched attempt to do diplomacy. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's really clear from the passage that Jephthah does not want to have war with the Ammonites. Okay? First thing he says in his response to the Ammonites is, why should we have any conflict here? That's the first thing he says. Okay? That's the first thing he says. Why are you and I having...
Apparently not wanting to fight means that the information you give can't be trusted. I don't know. But he seems to have a big smile and grin on his face and be laughing an awful lot about that particular point. So that must be what he means. But at any rate.
Big problem at all here. And he basically, he then goes on to say, well, you know what? This was not your land to begin with. It was the land of the Amorites. Okay. Now that's the first diplomatic blunder he makes here.
All right. So I want to make sure we're keeping all this, in our little filing cabinet for when we read Judges 11. Excuse me. It's not 11s. The first inaccuracy, Dr. Falk points out, is that he says, Jephthah said, we never took your land, we took the Ammonites' land. The Amorites' land. Very similar names, Amorite, Ammonite, right? And he says, well, that's inaccurate because this was originally the Ammonites' land that was taken by the Amorites. And he's putting down the impression that Jephthah is saying this was never your land to begin with, right? So, first, quote, error is Jephthah saying that this was never your land, okay? I want you to remember that because we're going to read Judges 11 and, frankly, expose just how utterly ridiculous Dr. David Falk is being here.
Because if he knew the history of the Ammonites, he would know that the land had been stolen by the Amorites from the Ammonites. So they do have an ancestral claim to it. Then he goes on to say, well, if the God of Israel gave the land to us, you should be happy with what your God
couldn't agree more
gave to you.
Yeah, but there might be a problem there.
There's a problem there. There's actually two problems there. Okay, the first problem is, Chemosh doesn't give land to anyone because it's Yahweh who gives land to both the Israelite and non-Israelite alike. Basically, according to Exodus 32, El Elyon, which is another pseudonym for Yahweh.
Right.
He gives the land to everyone, pagan and non-pagan alike. Second of all, Chemosh is not the god of the Ammonites.
He's the god of the Moabites.
It's the god of the Moabites. The god.
All right. So, 3. 1, Jephthah is apparently wrong in saying that the Amorites never lived there and that it was, or the Ammonites never lived there and that it was the Amorites who they took the land from. Number 2, Jephthah is apparently wrong in saying that Hamash is the god of the Ammonites. Number 3, Jephthah is apparently wrong in saying that Hamash gave the Ammonites this land. Okay? Remember those objections. We're going to read Judges 11. I want to let him finish his point, and then we're going to do that.
Of the Ammonites was Milcom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, you know, the king of Ammon gets to the end of this letter and he just ignores it because he says, what the heck?
This is so wrong on so many levels. So it's like
wrong on so many. He just ignores it. It's just like, am I dealing with a fool here? I mean, that's the response. I mean, if I had gotten that letter, it would be like, what the heck?
All right. So apparently, Dr. Falk knows that the king of Ammon didn't respond because he was just so flabbergasted at the error, even though the book of Judges never actually says that. Now, let's read the book of Judges and see what it does actually say. I am going to read out of the New International Version today. I don't typically read out of the New International Version because I'm not a big fan of that Bible translation. However, the fact that it is a more modern translation, probably a translation which Dr. Falk would use, is, I think, going to argue in favor for our point here today, right? Because a lot of people say stuff like, oh, well, you know, the King James is archaic language, and it uses words we don't really understand, and misinterpret, blah, 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 right? Well, you can't make all those arguments if I use the NIV. So if the NIV is saying that the King James did, then, you know, obviously, we got a good argument here. So let's go to Judges 11, and let's see how accurate Dr. Falk is being here. Okay. So, obviously, Jephthah sends messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, what do you have against me that you have attacked my country? The king of the king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messenger, when Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peaceably. Notice what the king of Ammon said. When you came out of Egypt, you took away my land. What is the claim that the king of Ammon is making? You, Israel, came out of Egypt and stole from me, Ammon. Okay? That's important when we read the following context, or read the following words here. Jephthah sent back messengers to the Ammonite king, saying, this is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, but when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, give us permission to go through your country, but the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused, so Israel stayed at Kadesh. Next, they traveled through the wilderness, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab, passed through the eastern side of the country of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. They did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was its border. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and said to him, let's pass through your country to our own place. Sihon, however, did not trust Israel to pass through his country. He mustered all his troops and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his whole army into Israel's hands, and they defeated them. Israel took over all the land of the Amorites who lived in that country, capturing all of it from the Arnon to the Jabbok, from the desert to the Jordan. Excuse me. Now, since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your God Hamash gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with them? For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, and the surrounding settlements and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? I have not wronged you, but you are doing me wrong by waging war against me. Let the Lord, the judge, decide the dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites. The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message Jephthah sent him. By the way, this one statement here, him paying no attention to the message, is where Dr. Falk gets his, well, he just looked at this and, oh my gosh, there's so many errors. What the heck? Even though that's literally not what the book of Judges said. It just said that he ignored it. All right. So let's go through this point by point. Okay? A claim was made by the king of Ammon. The claim was, when Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok. Israel, when you came out of Egypt, you stole from me, Ammon. And Jephthah corrects him. He doesn't say, oh, no, you never dwelt here at all. Rather, he corrects the specific claim that was made by the king of Ammon, which is, you stole land from me. And he corrects him and says, no, I took land, I being Israel, took land from the Amorites, not from you. We never made war with you. Why is he saying that? Not because he's making some claim that you guys never had ancestral claim to the land, but because that was the specific claim the Ammonite king made. He said, you guys stole from me. And Jephthah is correcting him, which is ironic considering the fact that the accusation being laid against Jephthah is that he's incorrect here. He is correcting him, saying, no, we never made war with Ammon. The land we took was from the Amorites. Again, that is the specific claim made by the Ammonite king. And it is, again, an outright fib on the part of Dr. Falk. He knows this. You really expect me to believe he's never read Judges 11? Of course he's read Judges 11. And by the way, IP, so have you. Ooh, battery's running low. This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, but when they came up out of Hey guys, I gotta plug in my charger here real quick. My computer just died. It'll take mere seconds. Please excuse that. It said that I had 10% left, which usually lasts me. It's roughly a percentage a minute, and then it just instantly turned off. So I wonder if that's because I was using StreamYard. But at any rate, I am still here. I apologize for the loss there. While I'm waiting for this to turn back on, excuse me, let me go ahead and reiterate what I was just saying. Jephthah is not here making a claim. No, you guys never occupied this land. Jephthah is responding to a specific claim made by the Ammonite king, which is that Israel stole land from the Ammonites, which is in fact not true. Go back and read the book of Exodus. Excuse me, this is going to be found in the book of Numbers. Read the book of Deuteronomy. It is very plain. It is very obvious that what Jephthah is saying is accurate. We did not attack and take land from you, Ammonites, excuse me. Rather, we passed around your land and took land from the Amorites, excuse me. My goodness. We did not take land from the Ammonites. We did take land from the Amorites. I keep mixing them up because they're so similar. So that is the first important thing for us to note here. Oh my goodness. When you turn on your computer, it just gets all your different pop-ups. Hey, did you want to log into your stream account? It's like, no, not really. Anyways, I don't know if you guys are on Steam at all, but I'm a real big fan of some of these video games like Total War and stuff like that. So, all right. I'm about to enter into the studio on my computer, so you're going to see a second one of my little things here pop up. Actually, it'll be my face. All right, cool. So, Jephthah was responding to the claim made specifically by the king of Ammon that the Israelites had stolen land from them, and we saw that that was indeed not true, because they had, because they had taken the land of the Amorites, right? The king of Ammon is saying, well, no, you had taken land from me. Jephthah is saying, no, in fact, that had not occurred. We had passed through, or passed around, the lands of Edom and Moab. However, we had not ever at any point in time actually taken any land from you. And again, that's a specific claim being made by the king of Ammon, saying you stole land from us, which is why I am attacking you guys. Now, let's go ahead and get our Judges 11 back up. I'm just going to go ahead and continue as if nothing happened from here on out, just simply because I want to connect these two at the end. So I apologize, guys, and I appreciate those of you guys who are back here, despite my incompetence. All right. So he corrects the king of Ammon, saying, no, we did not take any land from you. Rather, the land we took was from the Amorites, right? And then we have another point here. He said that, the Lord has given us Israel. Wouldn't you have the land that Hamas gives you? Now, according to Dr. David Falk, what he's saying is Hamas gave you land, and therefore you should keep it, just like Yahweh has given us our land, and we should keep it. But that's not actually what Jephthah is saying. Now, it's interesting here because what Jephthah is saying is to be understood in a diplomatic context, and that diplomatic context is actually being spoken of by Dr. Falk. So it's like he kind of half gets it and then kind of half doesn't. Let's read and see what I am referring to. Now, since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people, Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your God Hamas gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Now, Dr. Falk said that this was a claim. He said, Hamas has given you this land, so you should keep it, just as we keep our land. But that is actually not what's occurring here. Rather, we have a rhetorical question being asked by Jephthah, saying, would you not possess that which Hamas has given you? He's not saying that Hamas has given him anything. Rather, they are simply saying, if your God had given you a thing, would you not possess it? Likewise, our God has given us a thing, and we will possess it, right? Notice this isn't a claim that Hamas has actually specifically given or not given anything. It is a rhetorical question asking, if you have received something from Hamas, would you not accept it, keep it, cherish it, all those other kinds of things? Likewise, let us do the same. You see a very similar thing happen with Justin Martyr. There we go. My back is just kind of getting irritated with sitting here. We see a very similar thing happen with Justin Martyr when he compares and I can't remember exactly what, I believe it's a resurrection, if I'm not mistaken, but he compares the resurrection of Jesus to a rising, I can't remember exactly what it is, so I can't use that example. But there's a rhetorical example Justin Martyr gives comparing Jesus to Zeus, and he's not actually comparing Jesus to Zeus. Rather, he's trying to articulate a point in a way that the Greeks or Romans, who he's responding to would understand, right? And of course, we do this kind of thing all the time. I've done it in this video, technically the previous video, where I said it's similar to if I were to say Theodore Roosevelt was president 100 years ago, right? Now, in that example, I'm not actually confirming or denying that President Roosevelt was president 100 years ago or 200 years ago, as the other example I had given, which of course is wrong, right? Rather, I'm simply trying to articulate my point in such a way that a modern American audience understands what I'm getting at and has a point of reference. That's the only thing that Jephthah is doing here. He's not making a claim that Hamas has actually given this land specifically to the Ammonite people. He is simply asking the question, would you not possess that which Hamas has given to you? Likewise, we will possess that which Yehovah has given to us, right? This isn't some theological blunder on the part of Jephthah. The other major problem here is the claim by Dr. Falk that Hamash is actually not the god of the Ammonites, but rather it is Milcah, or as we tend to know him, Molech, right? And there is some truth to that, right? In the sense that Molech is indeed a god of the Ammonites. However, there are a couple blunders being made by Dr. Falk in this particular instance. The first one being an assumption that the Moabites are monotheistic, or excuse me, that the Ammonites are monotheistic, when we have absolutely no reason to believe that they were, right? In fact, all of the surrounding peoples, Moab, Edom, Ammon, the Amorites, the Philistines, they're all polytheistic. They all have pantheons of gods. And very often, they share the same pantheons of gods. I'll give you a perfect example of this, okay? Inanna is a Sumerian goddess who is called by the name Ishtar in Babylon and Assyria and worshipped there, and called by the name Ashtaroth in Canaan and worshipped there, and called by the name Aphrodite in Greece and worshipped there, and called by the name Venus in Rome and worshipped there. Same goddess, but different cultures attribute different names and specific attributes to the goddess, right? And she's also not the only goddess in the pantheon. Great example for this would, of course, be Asher, because Ishtar is considered the patron goddess of Asher, but she's not the only goddess of Asher. They also have gods who we would refer to in, our more common lingo as Baal, El, so on and so forth, with all these different gods. Marduk, right? And in other words, just because they have a patron deity of the area doesn't mean that that is the only deity of the era. And in fact, an example which you guys would probably be a lot more familiar with comes from Greece. Athens' patron deity is Athena, obviously. Athena, Athens, right? You can obviously see the connection there. It's not as if the Athenians were not worshiping any other gods. They still worshipped Zeus. They still worshipped Aphrodite. They still worshipped Ares. They still worshipped Poseidon. They still worshipped Hades, so on and so forth. But the patron goddess in this instance, of Athens was Athena. Likewise, it is true that the patron god of the Ammonites is Molech. It is not, however, true to suggest that is the only god of the Ammonites. But the problem actually gets worse than that. The problem actually gets worse than that, because there is very serious evidence to suggest that Hamash and Molech are actually the same deity. For example, we see that both deities seem to have a aura of child sacrifice surrounding them, right? Whether that's in the form of Jephthah's devil's deal, so to speak, or in the form of 1 Kings, I forget the exact passage, but the king of Moab sacrifices his eldest son on the walls, and Hamash is said to be satiated, or at least that's the point that he's trying to get at, is satiating him as well, right? But besides that, let me go ahead and share some specific points of reference for you. Go ahead and stop the share here, and we'll share something else. All right. Got to make sure I'm finding the right one. Here we are. All right. And here we have Wikipedia article on Hamash. The name of the father of Mesha, Hamash Melech, Hamash is Malik, or Hamash is king, which is from the Moabite stone line 1, indicates the possibility that Hamash and Malik, or Molech, were one and the same deity. I'm going to say that again. The name of the father of Mesha, Hamash Melech, or Hamash is Malik, or Melech, however you decide to pronounce it, the pronunciation there meaning Hamash is king, indicates the possibility that Hamash and Malik, or Moloch, are one and the same deity. Book of Judges 11:24 has thought by some to be proof of this, since it speaks of Hamash as the god of the Ammonites, while Moloch is elsewhere said to be their god. See 1 Kings 11 through 7. Now, notice 1 Kings 11 through 7 is going to attribute, or 11 and 7, excuse me, is going to attribute Molech, excuse me, as being the god of the Ammonites, right? But we already know from this earlier passage in Judges that Chemosh is said to be the god of the Ammonites. So how do you solve this problem? Well, the way that these guys are solving this problem, and they have another line of evidence in the Moabite stone to prove this, is by saying Chemosh and Melech, or Moloch, however you decide to pronounce it, are in fact one and the same deity. And again, we do have plenty of precedent for this. Inanna, excuse me, is Ishtar, is Ashtoreth, is Aphrodite, is Venus. They're all the same deity. Different groups of people, therefore different names and sometimes even different attributes, but the same deity nonetheless. And it's not just the Wikipedia article, which uses both the book of Judges as well as the Moabite stone to demonstrate it, that is actually going to make this claim. We actually have another source here to look at. Sorry, the ending of this video just kind of threw me completely off my groove. So I apologize for that, friends. But nonetheless, Chemosh was the primary god of the Moabites. See Numbers 21-29, Jeremiah 48-7, 13 and 46. By the way, notice in Judges 11, when he said, we did not attack the Ammonites, what is it that Jephthah said? We passed by Edom, we passed through by Moab. In other words, it seems to be the case that Jephthah is linking Moab, as well as Edom, with the Ammonite people, right? Which is further indication that these might be one and the same deity. Like the Hebrew deity Jehovah, this says Yahweh, but I believe the pronunciation is Jehovah. He blessed his people with military victory when they pleased him and allowed them to be conquered by their enemies when they did not. The Moabite king Mesha dedicated a high place to Chemosh, which contained a well-preserved inscription on the so-called Moabite stone, describing Chemosh's involvement in Mesha's battles against the descendants of the Israelite kings Omri and Ahab. And again, it is that Moabite stone that says his father was Chemosh Melech, which is an indication that Chemosh and Moloch are in fact the same deity. The specific characteristics of Chemosh are not clear in many respects. He may have been related to or even identical with, I'll read that again, he may have been related to or even identical with the Ammonite god Moloch. The Moabites, Ammonites, and Israelites were reportedly kinsmen, and the Israelites sometimes worshipped Chemosh, as well as their own national god, Yehovah. And again, this would not be something that is outside of the ordinary. In fact, it's not even outside of the ordinary if you just look at our God, right? He has his name, Yehovah. There are also many titles, Elohim, El Shaddai, Yehovah Yireh, right? Which is Jehovah Jireh in your King James Bible, right? El Eliyah, and El Elyon, and so on and so forth, right? In other words, it's not, or even just simply El or Eloah. In other words, it is not uncommon at all for people to have multiple names and titles for their deity, especially if we're going cross-cultural, right? And cross-cultural, I gave the example, Inanna, Ishtar, Astoreth, Venus, Aphrodite, same deity, right? So what do we have here? We have claims that these two might be one and the same. For evidence of this, we not only use the book of Judges in conjunction with what we see from the book of Kings, but also the Moabite stone. And both of these seem to give us pretty solid indication that Chemosh and Moloch are in fact the same deity. Dr. David Falk doesn't believe that, but he didn't provide us any reason for not believing that. Sorry. You repeated the Ammon and Ammonites thing so many times, but you never completed a sentence about it. Can you give a quick bullet point? I guess I'm not 100% sure what I didn't finish. I'm sorry, none of you biz, but I'm not, I think, following. Perhaps what you're talking about is I did say that the Ammonites were the Ammonites had their land. Sorry, let me back up a little bit. So the Ammonite king is claiming that the Israelites came up out of Egypt and stole his land, right? But Jephthah is actually correcting him and saying, no, it was the Amorites whose land we had taken. We actually passed by the Ammonites who dwelt in Edom and Moab. Hope that actually is clarification. I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to, if I'm being honest, so I do apologize for that. But if that was the point you were asking to clarify, then hopefully that did provide clarification. The Ammonite king is claiming Jephthah stole his land coming out of Egypt. Jephthah is correcting the Ammonite king, saying, no, Israel actually took land from the Amorites coming out of Egypt, not from the Ammonites. We actually specifically bypassed the Ammonites. Hope that clarifies the point there. And my apologies for the lack of understanding in your question. But for a brief recap, Jephthah was apparently wrong in saying that the Amorites had never dwelt here. Excuse me, that the Ammonites had never dwelt here. But he never actually said the Ammonites had never dwelt here. He was responding specifically to a claim that Israel had taken land from the Ammonites, and he was actually correcting the Ammonite king, who in fact was wrong. Israel indeed never did take land from the Ammonites. They bypassed the Ammonites and took land from the Amorites. He's not claiming that that land never belongs to the Ammonites. He's responding to a specific claim. What chronology point are you making? I'm not sure what the question is here. I'm sorry, Nunyabiz. The chronological point, I'm not sure what the chronological point would be, I guess. The only point I'm making is just simply to say that Jephthah is correcting what the Ammonite king is saying and saying that, no, we never took land from you. We took land from the Amorites. Chronologically, that would be directly after the Exodus, but I think there might be a misinterpretation of what I said. But maybe you can message me at some point to get specifics on that. Radical Love asks, what website are we using here? This is the newworldencyclopedia.org. The previous one was Wikipedia. And, of course, the specific sources are the Moabite Stone and the Book of Judges. Also, sorry, Nunyabiz, I do apologize for the miscommunication there, but, you know, it's probably just my own misunderstanding of what you're trying to ask, so I do apologize for that. So recap again. He is correcting the Ammonite king, and he's right. Dr. Falk is wrong. He's also not claiming the Ammonites never dwelt there. Dr. Falk is simply adding that. It's not there. He's not saying Hamas gave them any land. He is simply making a rhetorical point. Just, you know, you would obviously take the land which was given to you by your deity, so let us take the land which was given to us by our deity, not actually claiming it was given by the deity, but simply making a rhetorical point. And third and finally, there is evidence to suggest that Hamas is actually the same deity as Molech, and even if he wasn't, they're not a monotheistic people. And again, we use the example of Ashur with, excuse me, what's her name? Ishtar, as well as the example of Athens with Athena, of areas which have patron deities, but which still worshipped a whole bunch of other deities, right? So, there we have the conclusion there of the points. And, yeah, I mean, quite frankly, Dr. Falk is just simply wrong here. He got all the details of what is in Jephthah 11 wrong. And then when trying to correct Jephthah, he actually got the correction details wrong. So that's all we're going to have for today. We'll go ahead and do a part 2 of this probably on Wednesday. I know this probably seems like a part 2 because of the fact that the previous video had ended. But I'm going to edit these together and connect them so that they end up being one and the same video. And I do appreciate you guys here. For anybody who has questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything like that, please put them down in the live chat below. I'll try to answer them as best I can. Let's see. Radical Love says you should reach out to Falk and set up a discussion on the topic. I have tried. Dr. Falk will only speak with people seemingly who agree with him. This isn't just something that I've run into. It's something that plenty of other people have run into as well. For example, Derek from Myth Vision, Dr. Kip Davis is another example. Not that I'm a huge fan of Dr. Kip, but nonetheless, the point is Dr. Falk does not seem to be interested in having these kinds of discussions. In fact, when I had previously offered not to have this discussion with him, but to allow him just simply a platform to lay out his position, he actually responded by saying that he did not think that I was capable of understanding the position, even though I wasn't actually trying to argue with him. I was just trying to give him the platform to lay out his own position. Now, it's a spectacular idea, Radical Love. I absolutely do agree with you that it would help to actually see back and forth here. But the best we're going to get is possibly he'll respond. I don't think he'll actually give us the time of day, though, to be honest with you. And I definitely don't think that he'll actually be willing to come on the channel. That said, Dr. Falk, if you're willing to come on the channel, oh, I'd be so willing. I'd be so willing. As a matter of fact, I'd be frothing at the mouth, so to speak, because frankly, I think that basically nothing that you said in this video is correct. And we'll be having a part 2 on that here shortly. So friends, if you like the video, please do remember to like and share the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified of every time that we go live. Get this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. If you do enjoy the content to such an extent that you think I have earned the right to turn this into a full-time career, you can actually help contribute to that by virtue of the Patreon or PayPal. Patreon, of course, is a subscription-based service. You can give as much or as little as you like, and it will be taken out monthly. PayPal is a single pay service, so if you want to give but don't want to be committed to giving month by month, you can also give to the PayPal there, one-time donation. And I don't do tiers, so you can give 99 cents if you wish, and you can give 199 cents if you wish. It's anything that you guys actually wish to give. Links are going to be in the description, or not in the description, but in the live chat. And I'll probably place them in the description as well. I'm not usually very good at putting stuff in my descriptions, but nonetheless, I'll go ahead and drop them here in the live chat, and should definitely edit the description here. Get this shared potentially to Dr. Falk and to IP. Honestly, we got a much higher likelihood of getting interaction from IP than Dr. Falk, because as much as I disagree with IP, you'll never hear me say something along the lines of I don't have respect for him or anything like that, because he is at very least respectable and appears to be honest. Whereas with the case of Dr. Falk, I don't see that. I don't really like his dismissal of those of us who are younger creationists or early daters as being dishonest or fudging the data. But you know, whatever, he can make whatever claims he wants, right? Radical Love asks, do I have an email you can reach me at? Yes, I do. Let me go ahead and type that into the live chat right now. All right, it is the acpchannel@gmail.com. I just dropped it there in the live chat. Feel free to reach me there at any time. I must give you a fair warning. I am very busy, and so as a result, it may take me a while to get back to your message. That being said, I will absolutely get back to it at some point in time, and I do appreciate you, very greatly. Torches and Pitchforks. That's a new name. Thank you for being here, Torches and Pitchforks. I don't think I know who you are, but I appreciate you being here. Always good to see a new name. All right, so these videos will be connected. we're done here. I appreciate you guys tremendously. Want to ask you guys to just, continue being in faith, continue, being in prayer, pray for this channel. Pray that God's word is glorified, that God himself is glorified, that his name is glorified. And then if he wills and tarries, of course, we'll see you here soon, hopefully tomorrow for an open room and Wednesday for part 2.